Hi, this is Paul Metza. We want to tell you about a great show we have tonight featuring Louis Kemp, who just wrote a book called Dylan and Me. Louis grew up with a young Bobby Zimmerman, who later became Bob Dylan. They rolled pretty heavily for their first teenage years. Years later, they re-hooked up in the early 1970s. And among other things, Louis became the production manager for the Rolling Thunder Revue. We're going to talk about the early years, the middle years, the book, and more. Without any further ado, my guest, Louis Kemp. Louis, thanks so much for being here tonight.
My pleasure.
I really enjoyed the book. As one who grew up on the Iron Range, 15 years younger than Bob Dylan, I've been following his career now for over 50 years. And what I loved about your book, Dylan and Me, there were stories here that nobody's ever heard that really give us side to Dylan, who, as we all know, is a very guarded man, but a really personal and personable look at him. Tell us a little bit about the first day you met Bob Dylan and the camp and what was going on up there.
So we met at Herzl Camp, right outside Webster, Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin. It was a co-educational Jewish camp. That's why we went there, because it was co-educational. There was girls there. It was at the time we started to become interested in girls. And Bobby and I and Larry and 8 or 10 other guys were in the same cabin. And Bobby and Larry and I hit it off right away and became friends right from the beginning. And we went back there 5 years in a row. The camp had a big influence on us, and it was something we look forward to, months in advance, in ensuing years.
Let's bring in a man who I'm honored to say I became very good friends with, as did many other people in the Twin Cities or wherever he went. Larry Keegan. Yeah.
Best guy.
Yeah. So the camp, I'm going to guess, you tell me if I'm wrong, a week long at a time, or how long was it?
No, the sessions were 3 weeks at a time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Louis, do you remember anything in specific when you met the young Robert Zimmerman for the first time and what you felt he had going on?
Well, one thing that was noticeable and memorable is that he came with his guitar to camp. And he carried it with him a lot, and he played it a lot. And he told me and everybody else that would listen that he was going to be a rock and roll star. And he repeated that many times. And after a while, I believed him.
What stuff were you guys listening to on the radio back then?
So he was much more in tune to music than I was. He used to listen at night to those AM stations coming out of the South. And so he knew all the rock and roll songs, he knew the blues songs, and he played everything.
Did, between the time you guys were going and meeting at camp for 5 years in a row, was he yet coming down to visit you in Duluth, and were you going up to Hibbing to visit him?
Well, he'd come down to Duluth a lot. I didn't go to Hibbing very much because he didn't want to be in Hibbing, he wanted to be in Duluth.
Right.
That's where the action was,
Right.
By comparison. And then we would hop the train to Minneapolis and St. Paul sometimes because there was more action there.
Right.
And we had met a lot of kids at Herzl from the Twin Cities. So he'd come down, and part of the time we'd go on to the Twin Cities.
What, was Larry was a musician too.
Yes.
And you say in your book how he and Bob would sing together,
Yes.
Trade verses. It must have been a wonderful time. You also mention in your great book, Dylan and Me, that Bob did his version of Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes. In 1957, it was a day where the campers replaced the consuls in certain positions. And Bobby took over as the musical director from Shlomo, the music director. And
Was that you said that the other night at
Yeah.
the Iron Ranger at the book reading. Shlomo, was that his nickname?
No, Shlomo was the name of the counselor who was the music director
Okay.
at the camp. Shlomo, that was his name. And Bobby took his spot for the day, and rather than do something conventional, which Bobby wasn't used to doing, he said, "Okay, I'm the music director. I'm going to get up on the roof of that building was called the Ulam in Hebrew, which is translated to mean it's the activity room. Okay,
Okay.
we used to have shows in there, and there was a piano in there that he pounded on all the time, played and sang. He said, "I'm going to get on the roof of the Ulam and sing. That's what I'm going to do all day long." And he did with his guitar. This was 7 years before Fiddler on the Roof came out on Broadway. So he set the stage for that. And he was up there all day and singing every type of rock and roll and blues song you could imagine.
Well, I consider him one of America's greatest musicologists. He's written over 500 songs. It'd be interesting to know how many other songs he knows. I'm sure it's a lot.
Oh, he has a vast knowledge of all types of music.
Well, there was somebody put out a book years ago that just listed his cover songs that he's played over the years. And it was what, as a musician, what I so loved about it, not only was it hundreds of songs, some I'd never heard of, but it was country, it was bluegrass, it was folk, it was blues, it was rock and roll. He had such a wide expanse of knowledge about so many different styles of American music. After the camp, so you guys are now teenagers, and so what did you do when you come down? Like, where would you go and hear music in Duluth if Bob would come down?
Yeah, of course, we were too young to go to clubs,
Right.
So we didn't go to places to hear music. We'd go to the London Inn Drive-In in East Duluth. That was a big hangout.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Is that on London Road?
it was right on London
Okay.
Road. Let's see, how far was that? That was a few blocks past the Armory. And that's where the kids from the east side of town would hang out. We get our hamburgers and shakes and fries. But they had a big parking lot.
I played at the Duluth Armory for the WEBC Battle of the Bands in 1974, and my band, Damn Everything But the Circus, won. So I played that stage, but that stage it's legendary. I mean, Johnny Cash has played there, George Gobel, I believe Duke Ellington. It's been having music for, I think it opened in, say, 1924. So it had concerts almost right up until they shut it down several years ago.
It's a historical place that certainly should be preserved and restored.
So you go down to the University of Minnesota. Bob leaves, hitchhikes out to New York City to meet Woody Guthrie.
Yes.
I got to ask you a question. I laughed out loud when I read this, but you were a boxer,
Yes.
and you were also a hell of an arm wrestler.
Yes.
And you were setting up, or your buddies were setting up arm wrestling matches. It's putting money on you, I'm sure, in the cafeteria. I'm going to just guess.
It was at the fraternity house I was living at the time, Phi Epsilon Pi.
Okay.
Right.
And so they finally bring in the ringer that thinks they can take you down.
Yeah.
And it's a man that became a member in 2004 of the National Football League's Hall of Fame, defensive end for the Minnesota Vikings, playing then for the Golden Gophers, Carl Eller.
The Moose.
The Moose. I see Carl around town.
You do?
We share a P.O. box.
Oh, my gosh.
I can't imagine arm wrestling that guy.
So what happened that particular day, I was arm wrestling the whole fraternity, a bunch of wimpy Jewish guys. It wasn't so hard, and the whole fraternity lined up. I was sitting at a table, and one after another, bam, I was knocking them off. And Paul Goldstein, who was one of my friends and a fraternity brother, a great guy, unfortunately, he's passed on, was close friends with Carl Eller on campus. And when Paul saw what was going on, he said, well, I'm going to go get Carl. He didn't say anything to me. He just went and found him.
We're going to see how tough you are.
Yeah, let's see how
Kemp.
good you really are.
Yeah.
And so he went on campus. He found Carl, talked him into coming over, and after I looked up every once in a while I look up to see how big the line was, and I looked up, and after 7 of the fraternity guys, they're standing Carl Eller like this, staring at me. And of course,
That's a bit daunting.
Oh yeah, it was, and I was shocked, but then I broke out in a laugh, and then Paul shouted out to me, "Let's see how good you are now, big shot," in a cackle, and one of my claims to fame, to this day, is that I arm wrestled Carl Eller to a tie.
Let's give it a shot. Give it a shot.
Bigger than the seafood business, bigger than all this other stuff. That's I want that on my tombstone.
That's absolutely, in Minnesota, that is now legendary. You heard it on Wall of Power TV. One of the Purple People Eaters.
Yes.
Yeah, Gary Larson, Jim Marshall, Carl Eller, and
Page.
Alan Page,
yeah.
who ended up becoming a Minnesota Supreme Court justice.
Yes, amazing, smart
Recently
guy.
retired. So you kept going to college. Bob's out in New York. He writes "Blowing in the Wind," gets signed to Columbia Records by America's greatest talent scout, John Hammond, Sr. And what was your communication with Bob then throughout the years?
Yeah, so once he went to New York, and then, shortly afterwards, he started to make things happen and became famous. He wrote "Blowing in the Wind," and, then he started spitting out songs like "You Can't," unbelievable.
Right.
And the quality of them and the impact they were having, worldwide, one album after another. We were not in direct contact, but my contact at that point was through his mother, Beatty, who I'd run into in Duluth a lot. And she'd say, Bobby's doing this, and my Bobby's doing that, and we would kind of exchange messages through her, tell him I'd say hello, blah, blah, blah. She would send back messages. And that went on for quite a few years until one time I ran into her on Superior Street. That was the big street in Duluth, downtown
The main
Duluth.
drag.
The main drag, yeah. That's where we would cruise when we were younger to pick up girls, later on. And
You guys were hound dogs.
oh yeah, and those were good times. So she said to me one time, at that time in '72, she said, "Bobby said to tell you that the next time I saw you that whenever you're coming to New York next time, he'd like to get together." I said, "Well, interestingly enough, I have a trip planned there in about 3 weeks." She said, "Well, give me your number and I'll get back to you." So she called me a couple of days later and said, "Bobby said to give you his number," and she read it to me, and said to call him as soon as you get to town. So that's what happened. And I called him, and there was that familiar voice, and he said, I live in the Village on McDougal Street. This is my address. Come on over. And that was it. And from then we were together all the time.
We've got Louis Kemp, childhood buddy of Bobby Zimmerman's, then Dylan. He's got a great book out called Dylan and Me. He went on to, among other things, road manage the Rolling Thunder Revue. We're going to hear more stories after these messages. Stick around.
Bob, being the musician that he was and is, Buddy was a favorite of his, and he was influenced by him. So he was very excited to be able to see him in person because he'd been listening to him, on the radio.
Right.
It was a Saturday night, and with the wind chill, the temperature in Duluth was minus 44 degrees. Of course, we were used to that, but that's
Right.
damn cold, That's damn cold.
The wind blew heavy on the borderline.
Yes, yes. The car we drove was my dad's 58 metallic blue Buick. Bobby was 17, I was 16, and we were on our way to see what would be one of Buddy Holly's last concerts. He was 22, and it was just 3 days before he, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper would perish in a plane crash while taking off in an Iowa blizzard. Another great, Waylon Jennings, would have been on that list had he had not given up his seat to the Big Bopper. Waylon was not known at that time.
Right. And he was playing bass with Buddy.
Yeah, he was in the Crickets were not there.
Right.
So he put together a backup band, and Waylon was one of the people in that backup band, and he played bass, right? To this day, whenever Buddy Holly's classic, Oh Boy, comes on the radio, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck snap to attention. The words seem to be emanating from his soul straight to my heart. This was my favorite song all through high school. Bobby's musical interest was much wider and deeper than mine. Even as a child, he faithfully listened to late-night radio stations from the South, something that Buddy Holly had been doing in Lubbock, Texas, just a few years before. When I think about it, there never seemed to be a time when Bobby had not been a big fan of Buddy's. There is no doubt that the rock and roll pioneer was a seminal influence in his musical life. There were many similarities between Buddy and Bobby, but one that Bobby probably wasn't aware of, that they each had a high school girlfriend named Echo.
Wow.
Well, I mean, that's a rare name.
Take what you've gathered from coincidence.
There you go. It's widely known that one of Bob's classic songs, Girl from the North Country, was about his girlfriend, Echo Hellstrom. We arrived at the Duluth National Guard Armory for something called the Winter Dance Party, and found the tickets to be pretty pricey, ranging from $1.25 all the way up to $2. Well, $2 was real money back then.
Right.
Yeah, you could go to a movie for 20, 25 cents.
Right.
Yeah, so that was real money. We pooled our resources and shoved our way in, working our way through the dancing, partying throng of 2,000 excited, withering young people. With Bobby in the lead, we snaked our way right up to the edge of the stage, mere feet away from Buddy as he performed. As still as a statue, Bobby stood there mesmerized, never taking his eyes off of Buddy. Perhaps time has embellished my memory of that night, but Buddy seemed to be smiling down on Bobby with an almost cholesterol countenance. At one point, he nodded to Bobby, seemingly as if he knew his own remaining time was brief, and that Bobby would one day take up his mantle as one of the greatest musical artists in the world. Only 4 years later, Bobby would write Blowing in the Wind. 4 years, that's all. And start fulfilling that prophecy. I have always believed that a spiritual connection of some kind was forged that night.
Welcome back to Well Empowered TV. This is your host, Paul Metza. We are having a most enjoyable conversation with a fellow Northern Minnesota boy, Louis Kemp, who's got a great book out called Dylan and Me, about the life and times growing up with Bob Dylan and eventually working with him on the recently previewed show on Netflix, The Rolling Thunder Review, produced by Martin Scorsese. But we're going to go back a little bit. I want to ask you one question, because as you said in the last segment, you would be in contact with Beattie to find out what Bob was up to. Okay. But there's not a lot of people that were in contact with Bob's dad, Abe. What was your experience with Mr. Zimmerman?
Yeah, I didn't have much contact with him either. I knew him. Beattie was much more outgoing.
Right.
Yeah, and she was all over the place, and so it was much more frequent that I would see her.
Right.
But a coincidence, I'll just mention this as a sidebar. I ended up buying a building in West Duluth in 1985, which was originally the Standard Oil distribution and office in Duluth, for the whole northern Minnesota, in northern Wisconsin. And Abe Zimmerman worked in that building.
Wow.
Yeah, when the family lived in Duluth. And I didn't know that at the time, but I put in my my imitation Crab Delights plant in that building, 60,000 square foot building. And I found out later that that's where Abe worked. And I found out later that Bobby, when he was about 3 years old, came to that office and sat on Abe's desk and sang into his dictaphone,
Wow.
which was probably his first recorded event of his life.
Imagine what that would be worth right
Yes,
now.
yes.
I remember a great story I read somewhere about the young Bobby Zimmerman, and he was, I think it was his mother's birthday party, or there was some event where the family was over and Bob was young, and they said to him, "Hey, Babalu, how old are you?" "In May, I'll be 2." I thought, that's a
good.
bright young kid.
Oh, he was always bright.
So tell us about, so you were hanging out, you got to know your friend Bob Dylan again in New York, and of course he had God, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 records out by then.
Yes.
And then he came, he and his brother had a farm west of town, came into town, and you guys ended up at a Crosby, Stills and Nash show.
Yes. So I had just come back from my fish season in Alaska. I had a salmon operation up there, and I went out to the farm to hang out with Bobby. And he had just come back from New York, having recorded Blood on the Tracks.
The New York session.
Yes, the New York sessions. And so he said, I just cut this album, and we sat across from each other, and he had his acoustic guitar, and he played for me personally, one-on-one, a lot of those songs.
Wow.
Yeah.
So besides the session musicians that he used in New York City and the producer, you were probably one of the first people that had ever heard those tunes.
Probably for sure, and certainly the first person in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was before he went back in December and recut 5 of the records. Yeah, for sure I was. So then
And where were you? What was the setting?
we were at his place
At the
outside
farm.
Minneapolis at the farm, right? And then he said to me,
You were a lucky guy, Louis Kemp.
well, I don't believe in luck, by the way. I believe in blessing. I believe everything good that happens to me is a blessing from God.
Okay.
Yeah. Because luck is a random event. Blessing is a directed thing from God, and that's what I believe happens in every respect of my life. So my blessings,
Thanks for saying that, by the way. That's insightful.
that's my value system. So my blessings continued because then Bobby said to me, there's a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young concert tonight in St. Paul. Do you want to come with me? And I thought, does the bear shit in the woods? Of course I want to go.
Right.
And so we went. It was at the St. Paul Civic Center.
Mm-hmm.
After the concert, we went back to the hotel where they were staying. And Bill Graham and Barry Emhoff were there, who I had met on Tour 74 because I was on that whole tour with Bobby. And we got to visit with them, which was fun. And at some point, he was talking to Stephen Stills. And he mentioned to him that he had just written a bunch of songs and he recorded an album that's not out. And Stephen said, well, I'd like to hear some of those songs. So Bobby said, okay. So they got an acoustic guitar for Bob, and we went into one of the bedrooms off the suite, just the 3 of us. And Bobby's playing some of the Blood on the Tracks to Stephen, and he played a few, and then the next one up was Idiotwit. Well, Stephen was pretty loaded, obviously. To me it was very obvious. And when he started singing Idiotwit, Stephen got very agitated and paranoid. And he jumped up and walked close to Bobby and said, you wrote that song about me. Why did you write that song about me? And he was, like this close to him at that point. And so I jumped up and got in between the 2 of them and eased Stephen back so he couldn't get any closer, and I got him away from him. And Bobby just laughed and said, it's not about you, man. and he just kept strumming and singing without missing a beat. It was interesting. And I say in the book, a lot of people identify with the words in Bob's songs, one way or another, but none of them are loaded enough to think that was actually written about them.
Well, tell us a little bit about the last waltz period and when Dylan was on the road with the band for that 74 tour.
Yes.
And you mentioned in the book how Bill and Graham, once he got to know you, you just showed up with Bob one day. Bob says, "So my buddy Louis, he's with me," that you had the best seat in the house for every show.
Yes. Well, Bob invites me to go on Tour 74. He said, "You want to come hang out with me on Tour 74? I said, "Sure." So he said, "Come to my house in Malibu, I think it was January 1st, 1974. He said, "Be here by such and such a time. I'm getting picked up." So I went out there about an hour ahead of time. We hung out. Then a limousine pulls up. We go, and it pulls right up to the tarmac in a private airport. Bob forgot to tell anybody he was bringing somebody.
Right.
And he said, "Oh, this is my friend Louis. He's coming on the tour." And they were like, "Who's Louis? We don't have any. He's not on the itinerary."
Right.
Yeah. So I went on the whole tour with him, and once, but not as a road manager, as a friend.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Just as
Got
a
it.
friend. Yeah. And after, a very short time, Bill figured out, I was who I was. I mean, the close relationship.
Yeah, you're tight.
Yeah, he figured that out. And as a matter of fact, Bill says to Bobby that at that occasion, he said, "The hotel in Chicago is all booked up." He said, "We don't even have a room to put him in." He says, "That's not a problem. Louis can sleep in my room." And I slept on the couch in his suite for the Chicago concerts. And then after that, of course, magically, they found rooms for me in every hotel. And so then what Bill did, once he realized how close we were, he purchased a rocking chair, and he placed it right behind Levon Helm.
Wow.
Yeah. And
That is the best seat in the house.
yeah, and that's what
behind
Levon told me. Levon said, "You got the best seat in the house," he said. And I sat there for every concert. And after the tour, Bill sent me that rocking chair.
Nice.
Yes, I got it with a plaque that says, he put it in memory. Sound like I was already gone, but in memory of Lou Kemp from FM and Bill and the Gang.
Nice. Thanks for watching Wall of Power TV. I've been so enjoyed having Louis Kemp on part one with Louis and his book, Dylan and Me. We'll have more next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching. See you next week. We'll save you a seat.